Okay, today I'm going to be remolding my Dragon Priest mask because the old mold, it's kind of given up now. I've put probably, I don't know, in the 20s and 30s amounts of pulls from the mold itself, and it's getting a little bit tired. So I'm decided to remold it. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you exactly how I'm going to do this. Now, I've prepped my Dragon Priest mask. It's all smooth, sanded smooth, and ready to go. The type of mold I'm going to be doing today is a jacket mold made out of silicone. A jacket mold is basically a one-piece mold that you can just peel right off of the piece. So what I'm going to use is I'm going to use silicone, and I'm going to have a disposable brush. The reason why I'm using disposable brush is because they're cheapest, and once you get the silicone on the brush, you're never going to be able to use it again. So, well, you will, but it won't be. It'll pretty much just be a rubbery stick rather than an actual brush. So yeah, make sure you get cheap brushes when you're doing molds and using brushes. So what we're going to do first is the first layer. This is called the print layer. The reason for this is the actual layer that picks up all the detail. Now, this layer is the most crucial because if you get any imperfections in it, they'll show up in every single cast. So you try to do a thin layer for your first layer and make sure there are no air bubbles. The way I'm going to do this is I'm going to brush it on using my brush. Now, a lot of people try to sort of stroke it on with the brush like that. I think actually the best way to make sure you don't trap air bubbles is to do a combination of strokes and also sort of jabbing the piece just to get into the deeper areas to make sure that there's silicone there. So I'm going to do that now. So I have my silicone mixed up. I'm about to apply it to the surface. I'm not actually mixing up too much silicone for the first batch. The reason for that is, while silicone isn't actually that runny, you do have to leave it for about 4 to 6 hours, or even longer, maybe 24 hours to 48 hours, depending on what silicone you have. And in that time, it will run a lot. So if I used a lot of silicone, I'd end up with a little bit of silicone on the mask and a lot of silicone around the edges of the mask where it runs off, which would just be waste anyways. So I'm not actually using too much. I'm going to brush it on now. The first layer is quite thin. You just want to make sure you can actually cover the entire surface of what you're trying to mold. So I'll do that now. Okay, now that the first layer is cured, I'm going to add the second print layer. This is just to make sure that there are no bubbles in the second layer as well. It's going to be quite thin. I'm going to brush it on as well. But I will be using the same brush. I'm just going to use this basically to spread it on. This is just to make sure that it has a nice thick enough layer so that so it doesn't warp when you're casting into it. After this thin layer, I'll be putting a thicker layer on, and I'll show you how to do that in a minute. Okay, so the second print layer has now cured properly. I'm actually happy with how thick the print layers are now, so I'm going to go straight ahead and put on a thickened layer just to give the mold good strength. One thing I should mention before I do this is that for a jacket mold, because it's quite thin silicone and it's going to be quite a large piece, it requires something to hold it in shape, and this is called a mother mold, which is basically a hard shell in the same shape that the silicone jacket slips into, just to make sure that's holding its correct shape. Now, because we have to do this jacket, this mother mold for it, we want to make sure that the silicone lines up properly with it. And so what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to put some registration keys in. If you've seen one of my previous videos on doing a simple box mold, you'll notice that I don't actually do a hard shell for the box mold. The reason for this is that because a box mold is so thick, has such thick silicone, it can actually support itself. But obviously this can't. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use some registration keys. You're going to have to use silicone as well for the registration keys. What I didn't show you was that earlier I poured silicone into this cup up to here, and I just let it dry, let it cure in the cup. What I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to cut it out of the cup and slice it into individual little chunks, which I'll use in my registration keys. Okay, so now that I have a bunch of these silicone chunks, I'm going to put the thicker silicone layer on. Now, if you're using smooth-on silicones, then you're in luck, because smooth-on actually sells a thickening agent called 5X, I believe. And this actually increases the thickness of the silicone without changing its cure time. So it'll still cure in however many hours it's meant to. Unfortunately, I don't use smooth-on silicones. So what I do is I actually mix an additive into my silicones, which is this. This is a powder. It's actually a silicone powder. It's basically the same rubber stuff, but it's been grounded. It's been grinded down into a powder. Because it's also silicone, it means that it shouldn't actually change the properties of my silicone rubber very much. Yeah. So once I've mixed in the silicone powder into the actual liquid silicone, it'll be much thicker, and it should have the consistency of about icing. This will let me spread it on nice and thick. And what I'm going to do once I spread it on is I'm going to take the keys and I'm just going to embed it in the thickened silicone. One thing I'm going to do before I make the solid shell is, as you can see on this mask, I've used some clay to build up the edges here. And I'm going to put some silicone on top. The reason for this is it'll give an edge to the mold. This means that when I'm pouring liquid plastic inside the mold and sloshing it around to create the casting, it won't be as easy to spill any of the plastic as it will come up to the edge. Okay, so now I'm going to make the hard shell for the mold. Because of these undercuts here, like along the jawline, if I made the shell in one piece, it would actually be quite difficult to lift it off of the whole piece, because it would catch here. So to make it easier, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to make the shell in two pieces. So you can see here I've made a spine that goes down the center of the mask. What I've done is I've just taken little rectangles of card and I've placed them along here, taping them together to make a contour for the shape of the mask. I then wrapped it in aluminium foil so that the resin doesn't soak the paper. Okay, so now I've got my pile of fiberglass cut out. I'm going to use some polyester resin and the fiberglass to make the shell. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take some spray adhesive, so this is what I'm using, and I'm going to spray a thin coat onto the mask itself. This just helps make it really easy to apply the fiberglass. One thing I should note though is you don't want to use too much of this stuff on top of other fiberglass layers. In fact, I suggest only using this one layer at a time. So I'm going to stick on the fiberglass, but I'm not going to add any more spray adhesive to the fiberglass itself to put on a second layer until I've got resin on this layer, because if you use too much spray adhesive, you risk the resin not actually being able to be soaked up by the fiberglass. Okay, so now that one side of my fiberglass mold, mother mold is finished, what I've done is I've actually removed the spine that I made out of card, and what I've done is I've covered this where the fiberglass went up against the spine in foil. This just means that one half of the mother mold won't stick to the other one when I do the second side. So now that I've done that, this is ready to do the second side of the mold. I'm going to do exactly the same thing. I'm going to use spray adhesive to actually lay the fiberglass onto the mold and up against this spine. And then I'm going to use a disposable brush to brush on my polyester resin onto the fiberglass. So I'll do that now. Okay, so now that I have both sides of my mold finished, what I've done is I've actually trimmed the spine down and I've gone around the outside with a pair of scissors just to trim all of the unnecessary and excess fiberglass. One thing I would suggest also is to sand the outside of your fiberglass shell. The reason for this is that all these little strands of the fiberglass that you covered in resin, if there's any single strand on its own that got covered in resin and it's sticking up, when the plastic hardens, it actually makes that little strand turn into like a needle, and it can make it very uncomfortable to hold, which is bad when you're trying to cast something. So I'd suggest going over this with a bit of a low grit sandpaper just to get rid of all these needles as well. The last thing you're going to want to do before you open up your mold is you're going to want to make sure that these two halves of the shell will actually align properly. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my drill. I'm using a 4mm bit because I just have lots of 4mm bolts. But yeah, I'm going to drill a couple holes in the spine of the shell. Okay, so now I've got a bunch of holes that I can put some bolts through to make sure that everything will align properly. I can open up the mold and I should have my finished mold ready to cast. So let's just see if I can. You might want to use something in between the two halves of the spine just to pry it open a little bit. So that came off fairly easily. And there you have it. You have your two shells and you have your silicone jacket mold. So that's how you make a simple jacket mold. Hope you guys learned something, and I'll see you next time. If you liked that video and you want to see more tutorials on how to make your own props, replicas, and things like that, then head over to my channel and subscribe. And if you really like prop replicas and you want to keep up to date with what I'm working on, then head over to my Facebook page and like it. The link should be in the description below. And finally, if you want to see me make a specific tutorial, or if you want to see me make a specific replica or prop, then leave your suggestion in the comment section below.